The Gawkers, a short horror story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by McConnell. Though it is true that I had been waiting, it's also true that I had never quite known exactly what I was waiting for. It was only when I saw that photograph in the newspaper, the one that the photographer had tastelessly titled The Gawkers, that I really, truly understood what had happened and began to live in fear of when it might happen again. For most people, the 12th of February 2021 was just another day. Admittedly, the circumstances around the coronavirus and the restrictions that came with it meant that this 12th of February would be somewhat different to the same date in 2019 or pretty much any year prior, but in the context of the week, month, and year in which it quietly lurked, it was, for most people, no different than the day that came before it or after. Unlike me, most people will not have been anticipating the date, partially looking forward to and partly dreading it, and in fact would never have known or even suspected there was anything remotely special or significant about it. Though, of course, there was. If you were to ask most people in the street what they were doing on that day, only a few weeks ago they most likely would not be able to tell you, except that in certain parts of the world it would probably have involved a stretching continuation of their current lockdown situation. You could, for example, ask yourself right now, do you know exactly what you did on the 12th of February? Did you attach any great significance to that date? Were you waiting in anxious expectation of it rolling around? Probably not. For me, though, it was different. I had been living in fear of this date for almost 15 years. I had marked the days on my calendar, set up countdown timers to that date on computers that didn't make it even halfway to the day before needing to be replaced with a new computer and another new countdown. The notches in my bedpost did not signify lovers who had shared it with me, or record my trysts and conquests. Instead, they marked the days that passed since I started counting down to that date. In recent years, I had researched the possible significance of the 12th of the 2nd, 2021 from every conceivable angle. The date became my obsession, and once it had passed, my horror. For those who completely missed it, it might be worth mentioning that 12/02/2021, written in the way that dates are recorded in the UK, with the day before the month, is both a palindrome and an ambigram. It's a palindrome because it could be read exactly the same backwards as forwards, in the same way the phrase, "Madam, I'm Adam," can be. It's an ambigram because it is exactly the same, at least on a digital display, when seen the right way up or upside down. So, whether you read the number backwards or forwards, right way up or upside down, it looks the same. So far, so BuzzFeed. This strange quirk of numbers may seem to hold some deeper significance to some, and trust me, for many years I believed it probably did, but it doesn't, at least not in and of itself. Over the last decade, I have consulted everyone from crank numerologists to respected mathematicians, trying to decode what significance could lie behind this odd formation. From the former group, the answer was some hogwash about the date being deeply auspicious and a time for beginnings and endings to meet. Whilst from the decidedly more rational latter group, the answer was simpler and more direct: numerical coincidence and counting. Whilst it certainly did seem a coincidence to me that this date should have such interesting qualities, the significance was somewhat undermined by the fact that the people who gave me a reason to find the date significant in the first place could not possibly have been aware of it, either because they would never have seen a digital clock, would never have written the date in this manner, or because they did not even follow the same calendar. Yet, they all clearly knew the number, and they all knew that date. I should explain at this point that 12/02/2021 was not significant to me because of the quirks of its arrangement. I am far from being a mathematician, and even further from being a numerologist, whatever that even means. What I am is a historian. Whilst dates are naturally an important part of my job, a date as a number, by itself, is meaningless. It is the events and circumstances surrounding the dates, rather than the numbers themselves, that interest me. What I do share with numerologists and mathematicians, however, is an eye for patterns. For them, a pattern is formed of digits. For me, it is formed from incidents and occurrences, incidents that sometimes happen to involve incredibly special numbers. The first incident that brought this particular date to my attention was during my preparations for a class on the history of crime and punishment in medieval England, a topic that the squeamish amongst you might want to gloss over. The particular form of punishment that I was investigating, reserved for those guilty of treason, was the process of being hung, drawn, and quartered. Nowadays, this collection of words is used metaphorically to describe someone being verbally eviscerated or taken to task. A politician, for example, might be hung, drawn, and quartered by a particularly incisive interviewer or an opposition politician. We might complain that a particular celebrity has been hung, drawn, and quartered by the media if we felt that they had been unfairly victimized. Historically, however, the process had a much grislier and far more literal meaning. To be hung, drawn, and quartered was much like it sounded. Technically, the name somewhat confuses the order, as the criminal would usually be attached to the back of a cart pulled by horses and dragged, or drawn, through the city, before the hanging took place. At the agreed point for execution, the criminal would then be hanged, not in the way that victims were executed, by a long drop in order to break the neck and kill them almost instantly, but instead strung up and slowly strangulated, to the point that their tongue turned blue, and they were incapacitated but not actually expired. At this point, the victim was considered close enough to death to be somewhat anesthetized and only semi-conscious. This was in some ways a mercy. The final stage, the quartering, actually involved far more than simply cutting the accused body into 4 pieces. First, they would have their genitals removed. They would then be eviscerated, having their innards removed, after which they would be beheaded, and then finally have their body split into 4 parts, though one imagines that by this point the victim would no longer be paying much attention. As legend has it, Guy Fawkes, the infamous leader of the gunpowder plot to blow up Parliament, after whose face the anonymous masks you see at every protest were fashioned, was hung, drawn, and quartered. However, in what would become an illustrative lesson in the dangers of trying to be a smartass, he attempted to deprive his captors the satisfaction of torturing him by throwing himself from the platform of the gallows. This was an attempt to break his own neck and die instantly. Unfortunately for the devious Mr. Fawkes, the consequence of his leap from the platform was that the rope attached to his neck snapped. Rather than taking away the executioner's chance to torture him then, Fawkes instead deprived himself of the hanging process that would have rendered him semi-conscious. He was therefore fully awake and screaming when the dismemberment and removal of vital organs took place, the newly detached parts being held up for him to observe at each stage until he finally died, in agony. Whilst this possibly apocryphal tale would seem to be about as grim as this element of history could get, there is another example that vies closely with it for that title. It was this example in particular that first pinned my obsessions to that date less than a month ago. That example, which the curious can research for themselves, is known as the double death of Arthur Turner. Turner, who, like Fawkes, was convicted of high treason and subsequently sentenced to be hung, drawn, and quartered, went to his first death far more quietly. The process was followed exactly as it was with every other execution, and after having been emasculated and relieved of his bowels, it was thought that Turner was dead. However, witnesses at the time described that just as the beheading was about to take place, the body of Turner abruptly sat bolt upright and, screaming in pain, opened its eyes. So surprised by this was the executioner that he hesitated and took a step back, just long enough for the spectators to hear Turner announce that, "This isn't me! It isn't me! I'm not meant to be here! This isn't me!" Holding his axe limply by his side and watching this hollowed-out and blue-tongued wreck of a human carcass speaking, the executioner bade him to be silent, to which Turner responded by saying only that, "This is wrong. It's the wrong day. Today is February the 12th, 2021. This isn't me." With that, the axe fell, and silence resumed. There are several overlapping versions of this story. Some have the body attempting to claw its way off the platform. Others still have the conversation taking place after the removal of the head. In every account, however, the final words before Turner's second death are recorded the same. "Today is February the 12th, 2021. The only other strange detail about the story is that in every account it is noted that when the body sat up, the entire surface of its eyes, including the iris and the sclera, the whites of the eye, had turned entirely black. For most, this curious little tale is just that, a quirky story to share with students that held little more significance than being a strange and gruesome story. Where it begins to become more interesting is when you consider the others. A month after having read about this odd tale, I had all but forgotten about it until, I entered a particular dungeon room I had arranged to visit in the northern English city of York. Much like London, the city of York once housed facilities built and operated for the sole purpose of punishing and torturing the most notorious criminals of the time. Indeed, visitors to either city today can actually explore these dungeons, which have now been repackaged as a lurid tourist attraction that exists in some strange hinterland between being a museum and a live-action ghost train. Filled with grotesque waxworks and animatronics, as well as actors in costume, the dungeons are essentially a guided tour through the more gruesome elements of Britain's rather barbaric past. I have visited both the York and London dungeons, and found them to be not only very entertaining, but, on the whole, quite historically accurate. It was, however, to a lesser-known and certainly less visited dungeon that I had ventured, having been granted special permission by the university. This network of stone rooms beneath the ground and around a quarter-mile from the famous York Minster was made all the more striking for me by the graffiti etched into the wall of one of the cells. From floor to ceiling, carved into the thick stone walls over and over, was the figure 120222021, separated with slashes in a way that made the number look as if it had been written as a date, the 12th of February, 2021. Investigating the listed occupants of the dungeon and the cell itself, I found that the strange etchings had been made by a prisoner named Wat Merchant. Merchant had been accused of robbing and killing several members of the clergy and was hunted throughout the city of York and the surrounding counties for a number of weeks. When the authorities finally caught up with him, he holed himself up in a nearby cottage and committed suicide by drinking a poison made of nightshade. It was decided by the authorities that this act of suicide, coupled with some of the items found on Merchant's person, amounted to an admission of guilt, and it was declared that he would be found posthumously guilty, and that his body was to be mounted on a pike from the city walls, as an example to others. As it happened, and in a strange echo of the story of Arthur Turner, Wat Merchant allegedly sprang back to life before he could be mounted on a pike. Realizing that he was alive and that they would therefore need to go through the inconvenience of holding a trial before they executed him, the authorities decided to imprison Merchant and subsequently threw him into the dungeons. Once inside, and despite the fact that he appeared to have been rendered both dumb and blind by the poison, his eyes had taken on a jet-black color. He spent the time simply inscribing this number over and over into the walls of his cell. Merchant was executed a week later, and as planned, his body was mounted on the city walls in 6 separate pieces. Intrigued by the similarities between the two stories, the double deaths, the gruesome executions, the blackening of the eyes, and in particular the presence of the exact same number, I decided to explore the topic further, investigating whether this strange number turned up in any other contexts, in other historical events or legends. Little did I know what a can of worms I was about to open. Over the past 15 years, this passing interest, based initially more on a macabre curiosity than any serious thought towards historical investigation, has developed into a full-blown obsession. In this time, I have collected 74 separate incidents in which the figure 120222021 features prominently. They come from all across the globe and share a number of common features. In every single example, there is either some remarkably close-to-death experience, or, as far as those involved are concerned, an actual death and resurrection. In every single case, this incident is followed by a blackening of the eyes, and in every single case, the number, or what I came to understand as the date, 12/02/2021, played some significant part. Mala Feeney, an Irish woman whom I met in 2018, was pronounced dead after a major heart attack in 1999. She had initially been taken to hospital with chest pains early in the morning and had suffered a fatal cardiac arrest whilst on the operating table. She was pronounced dead and taken to the mortuary. After lying on a slab, lifeless, for 7 hours, Mala simply got up, left the mortuary, and was found wandering disoriented around one of the hospital corridors. Her eyes had turned completely black, and she never spoke again. I was alerted to Mala's case by a psychologist friend of mine who had heard of my burgeoning obsession with that particular number. It turned out that my fascination paled in comparison to Mala's. She would sit for hours in the home, tearing sheets of paper into strips until there were 4 piles, 12, 2, 20, and 21. She did the same with coins, and the small piles of pounds and pence were left all over her room in formations that amounted to this figure: a 10 and 2 pence piece, a 2, 20 individual pound coins, and a 20 pence piece with a penny, over and over again. Everything in Mala's house was arranged according to this number. Her cutlery drawer had exactly 12 knives, 2 forks, 20 spoons, and 21 teaspoons. Every book on her shelf had either 12, 2, 20, or 21 pages. She would remove all the others and throw them away, then arrange the books in order on the shelves so that they made the correct figure. Mala had never spoken since her experience, but had once spent a week signing her name over and over into a notebook. On each page, she signed the name 55 times in a formation of 12 signatures, then below 2 signatures, 20 and 21. What was particularly odd about this was the fact that the signature did not match anything she had signed prior to her heart attack, and was not even her own name. Mala died, possibly for a second time, in late 2020. Until recently, in Arkansas in the United States, a man named Ridgely Alderton was serving life in prison for having murdered 4 people, 2 young adults and 2 children, whose ages by this point I would assume you could guess. Alderton is a somewhat striking-looking man on account of having the date 12/02/2021 tattooed across his body in every conceivable way and at every conceivable angle. What is even more striking is that until 2014, Alderton was an accountant with a wife and children who had never had a criminal record and, as far as most were concerned, had never committed a violent act or even a crime of any description in his life. Not until, that is, in 2001, when, swimming in a local river, he got into difficulty and drowned, before miraculously coming back to life an hour later in the back of an ambulance and inside a body bag. Alderton, who never spoke again and had severe damage to his eyes, later abandoned his wife and family, became obsessed with tattooing that particular figure onto his skin, before going on the aforementioned killing spree. In 2014, I wrote an article about this phenomenon, the various occurrences and the strange recurring details that were widely published. On February the 12th of the following year, I awoke to find a pile of letters awaiting me on the doormat. None of the letters had a return address, but judging by the handwriting, they seemed to have come from the same person. Each large brown envelope was stuffed, almost to bursting point, with photocopies of newspaper clippings, extracts from books, and in some cases a mixture of both, glued to backboards and written in languages I could not read, with handwritten translations in English pasted on a card next to them. Each envelope was, in and of itself, a case file covering yet another example of this strange phenomenon, thoroughly researched with examples and sources. Clearly, I was not the only person to be somewhat obsessed with this date, and whoever was compiling this information wanted me to see it. I read of a woman in Mexico known as Black-Eyed Lena. At the age of 63, she had been killed when a stray bullet fired during a dispute between rival gangs flew through her living room window and passed through her chest. She was declared dead at the scene. Despite this inconvenient fact, Lena refused to remain dead and indeed insisted upon dying for the second time in 2018. By yet another strange miracle and resurrection, Lena had woken up as her body was being transported to the funeral home. Though she never spoke again, she did write both clearly and prolifically. Curiously, however, she did not write in her native Spanish, but in French, a language she had never studied, nor, as far as her family knew, understood. Lena insisted that the funeral arrangements that had been made for her go ahead, with the family burying a marionette dressed up to look like Lena. The photographs from a Mexican newspaper showed Lena, wearing dark glasses and kitted out all in black, standing before colorful explosions of flowers at what was ostensibly her funeral. Though she was referred to as Black-Eyed Lena following the incident, and on account of her oracular peculiarities, Lena insisted on being referred to as Margot by her family, and would write over and over again in huge capital letters, scoring the lines into the paper in frustration that Lena is dead. She would also repeatedly insist that she herself needed to die before February the 12th, 2021, a date that she would scribble into her notebooks over and over again. Another story, The 2-Day Girl, told of a man who had succumbed to lung cancer in a northern province of China sometime in the late 19th century, only to come back from the dead and for 2 days speak fluently in English. According to the legend, not only did this man come back from the dead and speak for 2 days in a language that neither he nor his family understood, but he did so in a woman's voice. The only thing that she would say in her native tongue was the numbers 12, 02, 20, and 21, which she repeated in sequence over and over. A similar story recorded in Italy in the early years of the 20th century had the added twist that the resurrected individual, a man named Etienne, made a number of predictions outlining events that would take place during the 20th century, including the World Wars, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the moon landing, and the rise and assassination of JFK, before expiring for a second time. The first time I received these packages, in 2015, there were 11 envelopes. The following year, there were 17. The number increased every year, and never at any point did I have any idea who was sending me this evidence. On February the 12th, 2020, the trend changed. I received only 2 envelopes. One contained an example from the 17th century and told of a woman named Mary Shuttler, who had died and was buried in Devon, in England, only to awake 2 weeks later in her coffin. How this could be possible was not explained. What was outlined, however, was how Mary clawed her way back to the surface and staggered listlessly back into town. Caked in mud, her eyes as perfectly black as the surface of an 8-ball, she reached the local tavern and, beating on the door, screamed over and over again that same infamous date. She was eventually shot and killed by a local merchant who declared her to be a vampire. Her body was reburied outside the churchyard on unconsecrated ground. The second envelope was different from all of the others. It contained a letter addressed directly to me. Attached were photographs of a woman with obsidian eyes. In the letter, she explained that she was writing to me from a secure ward somewhere in Arizona, in the United States of America. The letter writer had been committed to the ward in 2014 and had lived there under close supervision ever since. She explained that according to everyone else at the facility, in 2012 she had suffered a massive stroke and died. She also explained, somewhat cryptically, that the reason for her being committed to the ward was her insistence that the person who had expired in this body was someone else. Over and over the letter writer repeated that she wished she could explain, that she could tell me what I had stumbled across and what was about to happen, but to do so would cause a tear and endanger everyone, and she was not willing to do that. She signed off by saying that, of course, the day would come, and once the 12th of the 2nd, 2021 had arrived, I would have my answer. For the next 12 months I saw the number everywhere, and as the days counted down to that very particular and peculiar date, I began to become more and more anxious. I found myself willing time to speed up, not only counting down the days, but watching the clock, wishing away the hours, the minutes, until the day would finally arrive and whatever was going to happen would happen. On the 11th of February 2021, I did not sleep. As many around the world had done just over a month earlier, I stayed up to count down to midnight. I was alone in my home, watching the clock, a glass of whiskey by my elbow, wondering what exactly was about to take place, and I'll admit that as the final 10 seconds neared, I did feel a very real flash of fear. Midnight finally came. I entered onto the 12th of the 2nd, 2021, quietly and alone. Nothing happened. The following morning, I woke incredibly early and waited in anticipation of the morning post, expecting a deluge of envelopes. All I received was a bill. I scoured news channels all day looking for some great event, some significant world-shaking incident that was going to mark this date in the memories of mankind for centuries to come. Nothing. To say that I was disappointed isn't quite right. The same part of me that had twisted my stomach into a knot of fear as the clock approached midnight the previous evening was relieved that the day had come and gone without incident, but I must admit that I had anticipated the day for so long I did feel a certain hollow sadness that the significance I had attached to the day had come to naught, or so I assumed. On the 14th of February, I received not a Valentine's card, but a brown envelope, the front of which was adorned with a familiar script. Inside there was no letter, but there was a series of photographs and a newspaper cutting. The cutting concerned the escape from a secure unit in Arizona of an elderly woman and appealed for any information relating to her whereabouts. The photographs, 28 in total, and each labelled at the bottom with a date extending from November of 2020 to January 2021, showed a right hand in various increasing stages of what seemed to be decomposition. At first, the hand looked just a little off-colour, then it seemed bloated, yellowed, and greyish. As the dates of the photographs got closer to the present, the hand withered at a speed I knew was far quicker than general decomposition. It blackened, began to flake and deteriorate, the flesh putrefying and seeming to slide and ooze off the bones in thick, syrupy piles. Disturbing as these photographs were, it was the final photograph that turned my stomach. It was, I assumed, the same woman who had written to me the previous year, the one responsible for sending the envelopes full of evidence. Now, however, she was no longer a woman, or it seemed to me even still living. The same black eyes stared out from the photograph, but there were gaps. Much of the body seemed to have rotted and withered away in the same way as the featured hand, but at some points there seemed to be simply holes. Gaps and spaces where there was no decomposition, but simply nothing. On the right of her head, for example, there was a huge semicircular space through which the wall behind could be seen. The person taking the photograph, a Polaroid selfie, was holding up a hand that seemed to be entirely transparent. It was as if the hand attached to the wrist was made of glass or ice and had flecks and fragments of dead leaves still stuck to it. Though rather than leaves, The small scraps of blackened detritus were remnants of flesh. I put away the photographs, unsure of what the hell I had been looking at. It would be another week before I found what I thought might be an answer. The Gawkers is a photograph taken on the 12th of February 2021 by award-winning photographer Mark Lamond. It is the only photograph taken of a particularly singular incident that took place on that much-repeated date, but of which the media did not become aware until a week later. The photograph shows rows and rows of individuals, all sitting straight-backed on plastic chairs in a church hall in Maine, in America. Every individual is staring forwards, their eyes completely black and their mouths hanging open as if they are gawking at something taking place before them. These 77 people were found in this state on the 12th of February 2021 and were all members of a particular religious sect that some might ungenerously term a cult. The story has been suppressed, but reports can be found online by those keen to investigate the incident further. The individuals in the church hall were all found to be alive in that their hearts were still beating, but they were contrastingly, clinically brain dead. They had come to the church hall to attend an event claiming to provide a collective experience of past life regression. The literature for the event, which involved some form of mass hypnosis, claimed that attendees would be guided through a process that would allow them to experience their past lives, enabling them to enter the bodies of and see through the eyes of their former selves. Though, of course, I have no way of proving what I think happened, nor any explanation of the mechanisms by which it would take place, I do have some suspicions. What if, I have wondered, these individuals were indeed taken back, successfully supplanted into their past lives, but rather than coexisting with their previous selves in their past incarnations, they instead inhabited their former bodies just after the point of death? What if the person screaming from the disemboweled corpse was right when he said, "This isn't me"? That what he really meant was that he was from another time, that his consciousness had been supplanted into this body from centuries earlier, leaving his current body vacated, limp and virtually lifeless, gawking into the night. Was it possible that their souls had somehow moved from their bodies and their modern-day setting into bodies they had previously inhabited centuries or decades earlier? Was it also possible that this process could only be completed once the previous life was finished? Would that explain why some spoke in languages they had not previously known? Why could some of them predict future events? I thought again of the photographs I had been sent, of how most of the incidents I had read about, the past lives, were indeed far in the past, but considered also how it was entirely possible that one might be far more recent. I wondered what might happen if a soul from the present moved into a past life that occurred only in the past few decades, and of course, what might happen if the past life eventually approached the date on which the body of its current life was vacated, the date upon which it was sent back, 12/02/2021. I do not pretend to know how this could be possible, whether the palindromic nature of the date had anything to do with its presumably magical qualities or not. What I do know is that whilst I read dates in the day, month, and year format, if you read by the American method of the month, day, and year, there will be 9 consecutive days that are 5-digit palindromes in December of 2021. One of these dates will be an 8-digit palindrome that will read 12/02/2021. It's a date I am not looking forward to. This has been The Gawkers, a short horror story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2021 by Michael van der Voort. Production copyright by Michael van der Voort.